Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the True World Podcast. I am Barney, and I am here today with my co-host, and he is
Jacob.
And after the very interesting and I think thought-provoking discussion that we had last week with Jen about the art installment that she made centered around a door, I thought that it would be interesting to look a little bit deeper at that piece of artwork that she has done and maybe share our own thoughts on how that piece speaks to us and maybe the symbolism that we see. And going further into that, looking at other instances of the usage or reference to doors that we find in the Bible. I hadn't really realized that there were so many kind of references and allusions to doors and doors being so important in the scripture. And then it was a while back that Jacob mentioned that he was starting a series on doors. And I guess maybe before we look in at Jen's doors, I'm curious, how did the idea of looking at this notion and this kind of symbolism and this meaning of various doors that we experience as we read the Bible, how did that idea and then becoming a sermon series come to you, Jacob?
That's an interesting question. Well, it really started with seeing Jen work on the door in the basement. And when I went in to see how the progress was coming, we were talking, and then it dawned on me, wow, how meaningful would it be if after that door was displayed at annual conference assembly, if it could then be shared with the congregation at Worcester Mennonite. And so I asked Jen, I had no clue like what she would think or even what would emerge when I tried to look through scripture and find examples of doors. But I asked her, what if we tried a series on doors in the Bible? And she said, oh, that could be interesting. Yeah, I would support that. So then after that conversation, I thought, okay, I've got to see what I'm working with here. And so then I started doing some research, and lo and behold, there were many, many examples of doors in the Bible, and actually many doors that played a significant role in the stories in which they appear. So then it felt really good to take that information back to our worship team and say, look at this interesting art display that Jen has made. Look at all these interesting scriptures about doors. What if we put them together and did a series on doors as a church? And so the worship team got behind that idea, and we're very excited about it. So it came together. But it really did come from that conversation with Jen when she was still working on the door. And it was just kind of a little bit of brainstorming, but then it ended up bearing good fruit when we dug in a little bit more to see if it could be done.
When this idea first came to you, was there one specific instance of doors in the Bible that came to your mind, like maybe right away, or that you had really at the forefront of your thinking?
Well, one of the really first thoughts I had was about the passage in the book of Revelations where it says, or it's Jesus speaking. He says, I stand at the door knocking. Oh, and yeah. It's a very beloved and well-known verse because it presents this picture of Jesus ready to enter into our lives and into our hearts in relationship and commune with us. So that's the first one that came to mind for me. But then in reflecting more and looking more into it, some other prominent ones emerged quickly, like the door of the ark in the story of Noah, the door of the tabernacle, outside of which the people stood when sacrifice was being offered, the door posts and the door for the Passover story. That was another prominent one. We'll see one today as we discuss a little bit later, passage from John chapter 10, where Jesus is the gate, essentially the door through which sheep enter the protected area. And just the more I looked into it, the more there were all these doors coming out. There's the door of the upper room, the
Mhm.
room out of which the disciples come for Pentecost. When the Spirit is poured out on them, there's the door to the empty tomb that Mary and Peter and John, they look into, and they see the empty tomb. So there's all these amazing doors. There's even a door mentioned in the book of Revelations that John sees in his vision, and it's a door in heaven that opens up. So there's all of these very potent and inspiring examples of doors. So
Yeah, it's interesting how when you sit down to look at it and search about it, you find so many more references than what you really probably can come up with off the top of your head. And when you mentioned that, or when I was watching the service online and realized that one of the day's passages would be about the ark, I don't know why that the door kind of slipped into the background of my thinking all the time. I guess I was more focused on what happened, before and then during and after. But that the part about the door, like, never registered that it's such an important part of that story. But it really truly is, and especially how the door gets closed is so
yes,
fantastic. Yeah.
yes, and as you were just talking there, I remember when I was a little child, we had an audio version of the retelling of the story of Noah by Burl Ives, and
Wow.
that he's the voice actor who famously is, well, he's known for many things, but he did the Rudolph movie.
Yeah.
He was the
Yeah.
snowman narrator, but
Yeah.
anyway, in this version, I remember so distinctly as a child listening to it, and him saying, "And God shut the door." Out the door of the ark, and me as a little kid being like, wow, like God shut the door, and the way he
Yeah.
said it with such um focus and intensity. um and I should have mentioned earlier, um when I mentioned the tabernacle, and when we're thinking about doors, sometimes we're talking about that passageway through which people walk, but there wasn't like a wooden door of the
Mm-hmm.
tabernacle. It was actually more like a curtain hanging
Mm-hmm.
down.
Mm-hmm.
But when the temple is built later, it becomes more like what we think of as that physical door. But in some cases, when we talk about doors, we're talking about like a way through which people enter a space. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, well, Barney, when you talked with me this morning before
Mm-hmm.
starting, you had mentioned that you were struck by an example of a door in scripture that maybe you hadn't thought about in a while, or I certainly hadn't thought about it in a long time, from the book of Judges. Would you like to talk a little bit about that example?
Yeah, there are a few times in the Bible where I kind of find myself thinking, um, is there any other way that this kind of situation could have been avoided? Like in Joshua, when the one um, nation kind of tricks them into thinking that they're travelers from far away and then making a pact with them. And I always think, oh, if only they had consulted, because it specifically says they hadn't consulted with God about whether or not to trust these people. And then the other one that really comes to mind is the story of Jephthah, where he is the community comes back to him and they ask him to help them with these ruffians that are causing a lot of trouble. And he says, okay, yeah, all right, I'll help you guys. And then he asks God to help him and kind of promises, makes a vow that the first thing that comes out of his door, he'll offer as a sacrifice to God. And then when I get to that point and know what's coming, and I think, what have I just read in the books that describe the law? And there are sometimes some instances where a vow can be canceled if someone was unaware of the vow being made, or if the vow was being made in haste, or if the vow was being performed by someone who is still under the guardianship of like their parents. um and then at other times when you vow something, they leave, there is the stipulation where you can redeem it for a price, and then like an additional amount of the price. And I always wonder, is there any possible way that that his daughter could have been spared. And it seems that according to the strict is the way that the law is written out, it seems like maybe his vow was kind of unbreakable, that he had to um, that he had to abide by that rash vow that he made. And because what is sad, what an unfortunate ending to coming back and victorious, and his daughter so happy and glad for his victory, and then she happens to be the first one that exits the door to his home and greets
Hmm.
him. And yeah.
Wow. Yeah, what a tragic
Mm,
um, turn in the story, and that the door then would forever be remembered by Jephthah as the one through which his daughter
mm,
came, like
mm,
his um yeah, like you said, a misplaced, misguided um vow to do this action, and then him regretting it. So
mm,
after he realized what had happened and what had emerged, yeah,
mm,
it's so complicated because yeah, the door, the passing through the who passes through the door in that story,
right.
and the surprise it causes for him, and the sorrow, and um it's yeah, it's a very sad tale. Yeah.
Mm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Well, and it makes me think a little bit about what Jen told us last week, that one thing about doors is that they have great potential for a whole variety of things and outcomes, and like they can welcome a person or they can exclude a person, they can open up or they can remain closed. You don't know what's behind the door often. And so in this story, there was definitely an unforeseen outcome related to who came out of the door. But I'm kind of wondering, as we think, I mean, there can be quite the opposite too. And in the empty tomb, that
mm,
when there's nobody behind the door of the tomb, and the stones rolled away, Peter and John and Mary don't know how to respond, and it ends up being a very positive outcome. In that case, their surprise is that Jesus has risen, um, and is alive. So I know the door can mean different things. Do you want to take a little time and look at the door that Jen had created, or was there
yeah.
something else you might like to say first?
Yeah, I would like to. I think that's I know it's a good time to look at that. You answered one question that I had earlier when you said that you had kind of checked in with Jen as she was creating it. I had wondered, I didn't have a chance to ask last time, I had wondered if um, her working in the church was kind of open to anyone who wanted to see how things were developing, or if it was kind of like a, you know, top secret, the stores to remain sealed until the presentation. But you saw it periodically as it was being developed, or
Yes,
just hear it. Uh-huh.
uh, I did, and I'll share just a few images of that
Mm-hmm.
um, for those who are watching through YouTube. And you can see here in this picture, basically three pictures side by side of the door from slightly different angles.
Mm-hmm.
But it was in the common storage area of our church, and this area is not locked. There was no
Mm-hmm.
sign trying to
Mm-hmm.
indicate for people to avoid the area. It was there. If anybody came in, they could see it. And I think Jen just felt like fine working on it there. And
Mm-hmm.
if people saw it, that's okay. Eventually, they would see the final product, but it was just an
Right.
accessible space for her to work. But it was
Mm-hmm.
interesting because one of the youth in our church got really excited and helped Jen a little bit
Oh, wow.
with some parts of the door. And I think also Jen's daughter, Lily, came, I believe, as well, and helped with some parts of the door. And then Jen's husband, Kyle, um, was able to create the mount. And he's real good with creating
Ah.
things out of wood and constructing things. And so he created the mount which holds the door upright. And so
Mm-hmm.
it was a partnership that Jen had with others. I mean, she did um, all of the creative design elements and the visioning and the bringing it together, but she included other people along the way, which was very nice. And so,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, so here it is. Um, I don't know if you have any particular thoughts from this aspect of it. For me, I mentioned last week, I love to the right when you can see the part of the door that has the sequins,
Right.
which, as we said last week, kind of represent that potential for beauty and surprise when a door opens, or when you see things in a new light. And as light
Hmm.
shines on the sequence, the light is reflected and shines out into the room. And so it's that kind of potential that Jen was highlighting. But
Hmm.
is there anything that you would like to point out as you are looking at these stores?
Yeah, I actually had so I was unaware of the sequins, and when she was describing them and kind of the effect that she hoped that they would uh, be able to produce, it made me think of something that I have always um, uh, found interesting and highlighted in my Bible when I was reading actually about the tabernacle and it being set up in the wilderness, and the posts on the very outside perimeter that are connecting the I guess the hangings, I guess the kind of the fabric that goes in between, and it says that they have silver bases to them, and
Oh,
it also
interesting.
says that they are arranged facing east. And I remember years ago I made a comment in my Bible saying how amazing that must have been when the sun would rise and shine on those bases, because they
Mm,
must have really reflected the light and it must have just looked so fantastic. And then when Jen described this last week, that was I made that connection with that, and I thought such an interesting idea to add the sequence there, um, and
mhm.
and
I
I can
agree.
kind of I wonder if I can kind of I don't know if I can put the symbolism into her if it was intended or not, but the fact that she also mentioned the movie The Labyrinth last time, I wonder if she has that kind of interest in fantasy and kind of a sense of magic, kind of sense of
Mm,
wonder, and her thinking of like it having that kind of magical feel when you're how many times we see when we open on movies when you open a door and there's like the glowing um like the room beyond is glowing, and we
mm,
and it's so bright that we can't see in there very clearly, and it has like that magic sensor. And I wonder um if she was kind of going for that effect. And I
mm.
love that connection with potential, and it has a real positive feel to it. The fact that it's sequins and shiny, and um, uh, when I had been hearing about the door initially and being described, it made me think that maybe part of the intention was kind of a more neutral
Mm,
um, meaning to it, like not definitely one way or the other. Jen described that the fact there's no handle on it means that some kind of force must be exerted either to keep it closed or to open it from one side or the other.
yes.
And it sounded like there was not necessarily one definite um outcome to the meaning of this piece. But then when I see this sequence here, it makes me, in my opinion, it tips the scale toward this being a much more positive
Mm,
um, piece than um, and helps us maybe to not interpret it as in something that is maybe necessarily so kind of daunting, or
mm.
um, as more of a barrier, but more, as she says, as something with potential to it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Barney. Like she said last week, she didn't want to be didactic in how she
Mm-hmm.
presented the door,
Mm-hmm.
or be too directive of how people should interpret it. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, there's elements of how she created it that were meant to inspire, um, like openness in the conversation,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
um, a willingness to see potential. And as I mentioned last week, the first use of the installation was at the Ohio Conference
Mm-hmm.
annual assembly, which I'm going to go ahead to the next slide,
Right.
which shows that, um, with a beautiful blue curtain backdrop.
Mm-hmm.
It just so happened that that was where the door was placed, at a point on the stage right in front of a blue curtain, which I thought was a really nice contrast to have that. behind the white door. But anyway, at that meeting, there were a lot of conversations about how our conference works through differences and how we can be unified and how we do life together and what does it mean that we're affiliated with a larger body of Christians with our denomination and how do we work through differences on that level. And so the door, as Jen presented it, she didn't want it to be too didactic, but she was also trying
Mm-hmm.
to say, like, with the sequins and the other facets of how it's made, like with the branches, that
Mm-hmm.
God is actively at work as we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to work. There's the human door, but then there are the branches that are the expressions of creation and God's activity. And then also there's this potential for beauty to shine through in the conversation, with the sequence, and for us to be surprised and then maybe even if you want to take it this way too, that there's an openness, as the I don't know if we open the door or our minds are open like an open door, or we walk through the door together. There's so many different ways you
Mm-hmm.
can do it, but
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe that was part of um, the power of that symbol at that time, is to say, let's continue to be hospitable and mindful and open in how we talk with each other there. And also in the decisions that we make there, how it affects our culture as a conference and how we're open to other people and work through differences at a congregational level and greet outsiders and welcome them in to be part of our community, things like that. Um, so as you look at the door
Mm-hmm.
in this setting, are there any other ideas that come to your mind that maybe you hadn't seen when you were looking at it when it was being worked on in the basement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm I'm curious to hear how you think about this, but before Jen mentioned the kind of the part in the lower left bottom of the door, and she mentioned it was kind of supposed to be like nature, like I guess the ground, like the door was
Yes.
being connected. I Before I knew what that was, I saw it as like a garment that like kind of a
Mm,
wrap that was
mm,
cast down, like kind of something that we're letting go of
mm.
at the door. Like, sometimes we
Oh,
have
wow.
that notion, that kind of phrase to like leave things at the door when we're walking into some situation um unencumbered, like leaving our baggage at the door, some kind of like that kind of notion. I thought it was kind of the idea of casting off these things that we're bringing with us, that are hanging on to us, that we don't want to take with us into this conversation, that we're leaving them there at the doorway and entering into the conversation with others, into their space, kind
Mm,
of in a
yeah.
fresh, pure way. When I see the door, I see all of the whiteness, um, and even though the trees have no buds on them, it's not, it doesn't make me think as much of winter as much as it makes me think of purity,
Mm, mm,
and maybe calling us to go into something, especially knowing the maybe some of the conversations happening at the conference, going in there with a clean, fresh, pure kind of outlook, and leaving things at the doorstep, as they
mm,
say, is how I
mm.
saw it, before I learned the natural connection that she was going for, with the door
Yeah.
being cemented in with nature there.
Well, isn't that just a wonderful part of how art functions? It's
Mm-hmm.
that coming to it as you did, you had a completely new and different, unique interpretation of the art that was also powerful and had a lot of meaning. And I like your point there of leaving things at the door that maybe are kind of holding us down or
Mm-hmm.
are sort of baggage to us, and then entering in the door unencumbered by that and
Mm-hmm.
freer and lighter. I love that image. So that's also very powerful, even though that wasn't part of Jen's original like plan. It still speaks in that way. I like that. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah. Is it okay if I go to the picture of the door as it is in Worcester Mennonite Church?
Yeah, great.
Yeah. And here the setting is just a little different color wise,
Mhm,
but it's right
mhm.
up there on the stage. If I had zoomed out a little bit, you could see on the other side of the stage we have a large cross that has white cloth on it.
Ah,
So it's a nice complement
mm,
to the white door that's on the right stage to have the cross on the left. And that's something that we put up every year for Easter. And this year we started the series on doors
mm,
during Easter with
mhm,
the story of the empty tomb. And
mhm,
so um, it was kind of something that was there on Easter Sunday, and then we just have kept them both up
mhm,
this year because it's a nice
mhm,
complement to the door. But
mhm.
seeing the door at Worcester Mennonite in the context that you're very familiar with from your growing up years, are there any different thoughts as you look at it in this place?
Yeah, I guess the thought that comes to mind, and something actually I wanted to ask you, I wonder if does it feel to you as I mean, so from my point of view, seeing it from the congregation sitting in the sanctuary there, it I like how it's a constant visual that helps me to kind of connect with what's being mentioned in the call to worship or while we're reading the passage, and of course during the message, and helps me to kind of focus, um, think about think about the greater meaning of what we're hearing as I reflect to maybe how it relates to doors and maybe to this artwork, and then um, also being able to have it be like a cue to help me think more broadly about what I'm hearing in a new and in a new way. And I wonder, does it feel inspirational to you having it up there with you when you're speaking during your when you're giving the message each week?
Yes, it really does. Of all, I told this to Katie yesterday, of all the series that I've been able to do since I've been pastor at Worcester Mennonite, like these 13 years, this is one of my favorite series because um, it's very powerful to have a visual
Mm,
that is so central to the theme that is there every week that
mhm,
it's it's very accessible to people. Like if they want to after the service, they could go up and touch it or look at it more closely. It's just right there, always drawing us in. And a lot of times are there will be visual elements to a series we're doing, but they do not always um, stand out this prominently and are so
mm,
core to the messages and integrated so directly with the central theme. So having it there is a treat. Every week I enjoy it, and it reminds me as I'm talking and as I look over there, oh yes, like
mm,
there is the example of what we're talking about, that this door that can um, be something that is walked through or moved or opened or closed, and it's just yeah, it enhances my experience a lot. So I'm glad it's there.
mm.
And if
Yeah.
there were ever to be another art installation that Jen were to make for some other event,
Uh-huh.
I would really um, love the opportunity to talk with her to say, could we potentially do something with that in another series? You know, if no pressure, Jen,
Right.
if you hear this, but it's just so wonderful to have an artist in our congregation and who's
Mhm,
willing to share her art,
mhm,
and for it to be present through the series. It's been
mhm.
wonderful. So thanks for asking.
Yeah. Maybe one final question I had, maybe before we move on. What what was some of the before Jen described the door to you? What I'm curious about some of the symbolism or some of the emotions or thoughts or inspiration that you felt when you saw it.
Well, when I first saw the door,
Mhm,
I think I liked that um, it was all one color, and it was like it was a texture
Mm.
that was unique and different, because normally we don't see a door that's covered with like
Yeah.
cloth in this
Yeah.
way. And it was a little bit of a puzzle for me at first. I'm like thinking, okay, what is going on here? So I like how it drew me in. I like the theme of doors in general.
Hmm.
um as we discussed last week, just the idea of them opening, of them being a sign of welcome. Sometimes you feel, that sense of security when you close your door, and there are just a lot of interesting elements, and particularly when we think of faith and discussing ideas about faith, it seems like, oh, the door is so nice. So when I first saw it, I was kind of puzzled by like the materials that were used, and it made me think for a bit. But then when I was starting to think about, okay, this is going to be used for annual conference assembly, I'm like, I'm glad she chose a door, because um, the opening and the closing idea, that the idea of potential, seems very fitting for this type of conversation. But at that point, I had no idea what the branches represented. I had no idea what the
Hmm.
sequins
Hmm. Hmm.
represented. That was all, additional information that Jen shared over time that was even more meaningful. So I don't know if that answers your question, but um, that was my experience.
Yeah. I love that you were one of the people who had the chance to see it as it was developing. And I think that's it must be neat to think back to how you saw it over the stages and then now seeing it um, finished.
Oh yeah, it was really interesting, because in the earlier form, yeah, we just didn't know quite
Mm.
what twists and turns,
Hmm.
the project might take, and so, yeah, it was neat to see it emerge for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Um, well, since we've been talking about the door, as it's been used in the series on doors that we're doing at Worcester Mennonite, examples of doors in the Bible, I had asked Barney before recording today if we could look at the scripture that will be the focus of this upcoming Sunday, which is on John chapter 10, a story where Jesus speaks of himself as a gate through which sheep pass as they enter this area of security that he provides. And um, the term in Greek for gate is thura, and it's the same word in Greek for door. So
Mm.
this scripture seems to fall perfectly in this series on
Mm.
doors. Jesus is a way through which we enter into security and safety. And so I asked Barney if we could read that today. And so I'm going to go ahead and put the passage up on the screen. And Barney, do our um, windows block the text, or can you read the whole thing from where you are?
I can read it. Yeah. Fine.
Okay,
Hmm.
perfectly. Yeah, if you would read this first slide, and I'll read the second, and then if you read the third.
Right. Okay. This is from the NIV translation, and it starts. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them.
Therefore, Jesus said again, very truly, I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep.
I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father.
Thank you so much for reading, Barney.
Mhm.
So, just as we've gone through this passage, there's probably several familiar parts. The I am statements from
Mm,
Jesus are probably familiar to people. I am the good shepherd. Um, I have come that you might have life and life abundantly, from verse 10. I am the gate. My sheep know my voice. There's several familiar parts to this passage, but
mhm,
maybe one that people don't think about often, but is really interesting, is verse 16. And
mm,
I really find this one fascinating. I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. And at the time, we're told earlier in the passage that Jesus is speaking with the Pharisees.
mhm,
And so it was just a common understanding at that time that Israel was the sheepfold of God. But here, Jesus is talking about other sheep. And this is one of those cases where the message opens up, and then we have a glimpse into Jesus' intent that Gentiles will be brought into the sheepfold as well. So others who weren't expected to go through this gate, to be brought into this place of security and provision that Jesus provides, will now also include Gentiles, unexpected people, people who were previously thought would be excluded, which makes me think that when we say that Jesus is the gate, it's so fascinating to think of how broad and how unique and how universal in a way of a gate Jesus is, that he is for people of every type of background, not just the people of Israel, but he is willing to meet people where they are from all these different backgrounds, Gentiles who weren't expected to enter in and be part of the flock. And that is really inspiring to me, that Jesus is that type of door that would um, adapt and open up to and welcome people from many different backgrounds. So I'll stop talking there and give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, one thing I like so well about the Gospel of John is I feel like the things that we read that from when Jesus is speaking is so stark. It feels like there's absolutely no filter. And what we see in chapter 6 even, it's we see that people, some of the people, things that he says that Jesus said were hard for them to hear and hard for them to accept. And it gives us a sense of how revolutionary the things Jesus were saying were. And him saying these things to the Pharisees, who, like you said, were absolutely convinced. What were they reading day in and day out? That Israel is for God and God is for Israel. And who is this person to be speaking of other sheep that are going to be brought into the pen with us? And I, I, for me, of course, hearing that is amazing, and makes me think how um, important it was that the disciples and the people who wrote the gospel wrote it how they did to get it out there. It's kind of um, uh, had it made it accessible for these sheep from the other pens to hear Jesus's word and realize that they had a place too. Because we see where Jesus, as you mentioned in verse 16, Jesus said that he will bring them into the pen, and you're maybe wondering how is he gathering them? How is he bringing them? And because at that time he didn't have so many interactions. He had that we know of. We had some interactions with Gentiles, but um, you get the sense of it. It's so much, like you say, so much broader, so much wider and bigger than what we hear, what we see of him interacting with the Gentiles during his ministry, and get the sense that he's really speaking in the future of his words and his message and his truth, bringing so many people into this ever widening sheep pen that he has established for us and is keeping us safe in there and cared for.
Yes, that's right. And it's so interesting too that one of the parts of the verse mentions that the sheep pen um, is a place where the sheep come in. They come in through the gate. They enter this place that Jesus provides, but then also they go back out to pasture. And there's this coming and there's this going. And we would assume that when they go out to pasture, the imagery then also becomes, as it's also mentioned in the passage, that Jesus serves as a shepherd who goes out with them to keep them safe when they're out during the day venturing around. And so um, the the doorway is not one that when we walk through it, it just means that we're um, separated and only in one place, but it's a place of security and following the metaphor at nighttime, when we need our rest. But then also when the day comes, we're sent out into the world, into the pasture, and Jesus goes with us there where we are. And it's just a really interesting image of coming and going and Jesus being involved with both that I really like. And also the intimacy of uh, knowing the voice of the shepherd. Jesus says, "My sheep know my voice, and I know them." And it was really interesting in our men's group. We were able to talk with your dad, Barney, about
Mm-hmm.
what it's like to actually raise sheep. And he told us how when he would go out to feed the sheep or check on them, they would come to him because they knew him. But if
Mm-hmm.
somebody else went out there, they could tell and they wouldn't go running to that person. And so there is a connection there that's so sweet and meaningful that Jesus wants to know each of us and for us to know him and have a deep connection that we could recognize his voice and be um, drawn to him. Jim Bay, who used to be um, connected with Worcester Mennonite Church and still is connected,
Mm-hmm.
but had to move away to support family with his wife Cindy. They're now in Gallup, New Mexico. Um, but anyway, he wrote me an email because he knew that this passage was coming up for us as a church, and he said they just looked at it at their church a couple weeks ago, and he prepared the service, and he looked at this image of the sheep and the shepherd, and he came up with a thought that many of us are more like cats than like sheep. And so he wrote this interesting reflection and the call to worship about like, yeah, we like our independence. We like to do our own thing. And when Jesus calls to us, we might like recognize his voice, but maybe we're more like cats. We don't always want to follow. And I thought, what a interesting image, So I wrote him back. I'm like, Jim, I really like that. I'm gonna have to use that in the sermon if that's okay with you. And he said, sure. But anyway, so another take on like knowing the voice of Jesus also means there's an element, if we're called or we hear it, there's an element of choice or decision. Like, how will we respond?
Mm-hmm.
Will we give attention to it when we
Mm-hmm.
act. So
Mm-hmm.
is that really interesting thought? But when I was getting ready for this sermon, I actually met with Julie to talk about this passage because I thought one of the pressure points when you talk about being out in the world and interacting with other people and having this belief as Christians that Jesus has offered this sense of security and relationship, and like he's done something very unique and special through his grace. But when, like you said, sometimes his message, when it was heard, people were like really taken
Mm-hmm.
aback, or
Mm-hmm.
um, I guess you would say frustrated, or um, I don't know if I'd say scandalized, but at times they just really found it challenging what Jesus
Mm-hmm.
was saying. And when he makes the statement in the passage that I am the gate, and you go through me, in a multicultural society with people from many backgrounds, as we've already said, like that's a fantastic place where Jesus wants to be. He wants to meet people of every background and like
Mm-hmm.
truly meet them where they are, not try to make them into something they're not. But at the same time, the part of his message where he says, I'm the gate, people can be like, well, that sounds exclusive. And it sounds like he's, um, trying to make a claim that would narrow things down. And I
Mm-hmm.
guess, I wrestled with that this week. And as I've been thinking about it, and where I keep landing is like Jesus, what he did is unique. Like the type of grace he offers is unique, but the call, I believe, more and more than as I look at it, is as a universal call to all types of people. So I don't think that it's when he says I'm the gate, it's meant to be saying like it's about exclusion. I think
Mm-hmm.
he's saying I'm the gate, meaning like I want to open up to every type of person and bring them into this experience and this relationship that I've created, or that is possible with me. So anyway, those are just some thoughts that I have.
Yeah, I like that too. And it it reminds me of some things from my own childhood. The notion of the sheep pen, and Jesus saying that um, anyone who enters the sheep pen in a different way is a thief, or and then kind of the notion that the sheep themselves can't enter the pen unless it's through the gate. And I remember I have memories of when I was helping my dad, and like either the sheep were excited to come in to eat, or they were excited to go out, and they all kind of really rush. They all kind of rush together. And but then also maybe kind of referencing what my dad said, when there's a stranger or when they get spooked, sometimes the sheep do kind of try to climb that gate. They try to get in a
Oh,
different way, or
interesting.
like the side of the pen. And sheep are all hooves. They can't get a grip on anything, and you see the sheep flailing, and there's no chance of the sheep getting in
Mm.
to the pen through that way that isn't the gate.
Mm.
And in a way, thinking of it that way, it makes me think of Jesus's parable, um, his example with the wedding feast, and the people having to have the wedding clothes on, in
Mm.
order to get into the feast.
Mm.
But then bringing that back to what you said, um, yeah, Jesus really at the very toward the end, he specifically says that there are other sheep that he's
Yes.
calling, and it's not a certain other sheep, or he says it in such a broad way that we can all see that, myself, my neighbor, that person down the street, you know Jesus saying that these other sheep are also acceptable. It can mean, like you say, it can mean any of us. And that the way into this pen and in and out is through Jesus. And I like how you say that, remind us that as the shepherd, he's not just the gate, but the shepherd, and going with us with our comings and goings. And that the at the end of the day, or throughout the day, our refuge is in Jesus, and for everyone. I really appreciate that, hearing it that way.
Thank you, Barney.
Mhm.
And I really like um, hearing the story of real life sheep entering a pen.
uh,
And this Sunday in church, actually, I'm really looking forward to hearing from your dad. He's going to share a little
mhm,
bit with the congregation
mhm.
about his experience raising sheep, and I can't wait for that. I think that's going to be very meaningful. And uh, have you ever heard of the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins before?
I know, huh?
Um, he wrote a poem as kingfishers catch fire, um, and there's a line in the poem called "Christ plays in 10,000 places," and he has this vision. He uses a lot of natural imagery, but he has this image of Jesus really being present all over the world and meeting. The extension of that here, I think, in with capacity to meet people wherever they are. And one of the early Christian understandings of Jesus, and it's even in the New Testament too, is his connection with the Word. Jesus is like the embodiment of the Word that was with God at the beginning, at creation. That he, as the Son, is a reflection of God's Word. And the early Christian writers have this term called the seeds of the Word are scattered all throughout um, creation and all of the things around us. And so I guess talking about art and imagination, when I
Mm,
think of Jesus as um, the gate this morning, I just really think that the type of gate he is a gate that is can meet and open for people wherever they are in their location around the world, and that he, with that type of heart that he has for people, knowing who they are and what their background is, and to me that's very um, inspiring, and it's a good reminder that sometimes, in the context of the church and how we talk about theology and sharing Jesus, it's so important to share our experience of Jesus and to point people to him and his message. But it's also humbling when you think about like the part of the scripture about he has other sheep that we don't know about. And like when you think about these other images of Jesus being in all these places around the world at work, that we need to be humble and how he can work in people's lives, and not ever assume that somebody can't or be
mhm,
part of the flock, or
mm.
or um, won't can't have access to the door to open for them, or so in that spirit, I thought it would be interesting to look at a few final pictures here of
Mhm,
doors uh, reflecting different um, cultures around the world.
mhm.
And so here is a door that Barney and I both know.
Oh yeah.
And this is the door just outside Tulipan Hungarian pastry and coffee shop. And, I think um, just to make a connection here, one of the parts of the passage is about the sheep coming and going. Jesus is with them during the day, during their normal routine. Well, we as humans love to get coffee, to have
Oh
meals
yeah.
together. And there's something special about sitting around the table together
Mm,
and experiencing that fellowship. And just to think that Jesus is present when we break bread with others, and
mm.
um, when we break bread that is not the bread we're used to, whether it's bread
Yeah.
from another culture. Maybe it's in a Hungarian pastry.
Mm.
Maybe, just maybe, the bread we're breaking is ramen from a delicious ramen shop in Japan, Bayashi Ramen, or Ramen Bayashi, excuse me.
Mhm,
This was the first place that Barney took me to when I visited him in 2019
mm,
for my
mm,
sabbatical, and it was so delicious. I loved,
mm,
I loved it. I got off the plane and met Barney, and then we went here, and I felt so full and satisfied, and um, that sense of enjoyment, I think, is kind of that abundant life, is connected with that image
Mm.
of abundant life that Jesus offers. He wants us to have abundant life,
Mm-hmm.
being together with others, feeling full, feeling satisfied, and also realizing that He is present with us. I shared this with Barney and Jen last week after we stopped recording, but here is the Blue Door
Mm.
here in Northwest Ohio, a restaurant that has breakfast and a lot of different items that Katie and I went to enjoy recently. And um, I believe Jesus was present with us when we were there in that
Mm-hmm.
restaurant, having our meal and sitting there among all the other people who were enjoying their time. And finally, this door might be familiar to some of our listeners if they followed us for a while. This is the door that our guest Zhen Guo shared with us on our episode related to Chinese New Year. This is how she decorated her door to celebrate. And Jesus is present in our times of celebration. And so hopefully, as we've spent some time thinking about how Jesus is a door to us, we've seen the type of door that he is, a door that meets us where we are, a door that opens up to people from all types of backgrounds. And it can inspire us when we're living life to
Mm.
take a moment and to reflect and say, oh, maybe Jesus is calling my voice right now. Maybe I can sense that he is with me in this place. Maybe I can open up to the neighbor who's beside me and realize
Mm.
that he cares about them, that they can be part of this flock that he has. And hopefully that can be very meaningful and inspiring to us indeed.
I love the point that you made, and I just now got it about being a place where people are meeting and gathering, and maybe it's because the word sheep in English doesn't have a plural form, that it's one sheep and two sheep, you know, that maybe we missed that. But yeah, inside this pen, it's full of sheep. You know, it's not just me inside the pen with Jesus. It's not just Jacob inside the pen with Jesus. It's me and Jacob and the person across the street and the person across the country and a person across the globe. You know, we're all have the same wool, and that wool has been dyed and washed by Jesus, who is the one thing encompassing all of us, and we're all in there together enjoying being a part of this same fellowship, not butting heads and bumping one another and trying to force someone out of the pen, but the pen is big enough for and expands enough for everyone to be in there together. Um, I love that. I love that important part about inside the pen is all of us, not just a handful of us, but all of us are in there together. And Jesus is the gateway. Jesus is the way into that pen. And I love the way you described that when you were talking about the bakery and the other gathering places that are accessible because of these doors and what it means to be together when we're in there too. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barney. Is there anything else that you would like to mention before we close?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's all.
Wonderful. Well, Barney and I would like to thank you for joining us as we went on this journey today, reflecting on doors. We appreciate you taking time and hope that something from today's conversation would speak to you. And as you continue to think about doors in your own life, may you find sources of inspiration and hope in the potential of what can open up before you. Thank you again, and until next time.